that also depends upon your involvement within the legislative process, your involvement within politics, which is why the Panther Party refers to all education as political education. Okay? Because a lot of times our people have been conditioned to not like that word. Oh, I don't want to learn politics. I don't want to learn. I don't want to be involved in politics. So we don't want our PE. But politics is everything. Everything is politics. That is the bottom line to that. You must be aware of that, people, because when you go into now redefining things in a position to give you your power back, you have to know and put yourself at the center of that education or that political process, which is more than just voting. Okay, way more than just voting. So I
Evolving barbaric hieroglyphs, I spit my gifts, skill your surface with vernacular skill. The raw is near, touching down like meteors, none other than black gods. Stones in my timepiece coming from black stars. Negativity for keep far away from doors. Single-mindedly destroying the ops and the odds. Just another warrior's quest. The past may get rest. Demons coming for my crown, get beheaded like the next. These blessings never threats, just to verbalize a message, catching energies. The critics, all the Atari get deaded. Pray I stay alert on the field, be skillmatic. In anything my enemies still be dead actions. I proceed just life I lead beneath it. So many seas to win. It's our time to align stars. So spirits lead. Who could war with me? Catastrophically or audibly. Given no choice by God's law, I'm Lucifer on streets.
did shoot the presentation. We'll be going over to those of y'all who email address I do have. Everyone else, again, if you just leave your email in the chat and you want a copy of the information that's being shared on the screen, then just leave your email and then I'll forward it to you. So for those of y'all that are not members, basically this is the Black Panther Party San Diego chapter, and what we like to start doing is at least every other week providing political education to the community on subject matters or perspectives of subject matters that we think is very important for the community to engage and add to their what I like to call tool shed of weapons in terms of just being able to address life and life changes and lifestyle changes. Our goal within the Panther Party, one of our goals is to just raise the consciousness, the productive consciousness of our people. I like to say productive consciousness because oftentimes you hear the word consciousness or conscious people thrown around and it becomes so cliche, especially on social media. The idea here is that everything you absorb in terms of your consciousness lead to a positive action that is applied to your day-to-day life that will progress our people in a forward moving measure. So it's not just good enough to be aware, especially when it comes to problems, just pointing out problems. It's not good enough to just simply be aware of the problems, but we need to think in terms of problem solution, not problem running hard or problem, hey, I'm just simply aware that this is going on and I'm empowered because I'm aware. Because being aware of something does bring a small level of empowerment, but the problem with that is if you don't know how to utilize that knowledge to be able to circumvent that obstacle and prevent that obstacle from being something that you constantly have to address and deal with, then all you're doing is coping. And at best, you're really not empowering the process to make change, progressive change, or prevent that from being in your path of progress, especially as it applies to a people moving forward. So when we talk about bringing our people to a high state of progressive consciousness, our goal is that we go from dealing with simply survival to a status of living. And oftentimes, as especially within the Black community and oppressed people in general, we find ourselves learning to adjust to certain circumstances and conditions. But simply adjusting to these circumstances and conditions do not free you from those conditions. What it does is it gives you a position of coping. And when we learn to cope as a lifestyle for addressing challenges, especially challenges that lead to oppression specifically, then basically what we're doing is we're finding ways to adapt to slow poison. And finding ways to adapt to slow poison is still suicide. It's still you being enslaved. It's still you projecting yourself to a point of not escaping the condition in which is oppressing or confining you. So from a mental perspective, one of our goals within the Panther Party is to work toward bringing us to more of a collective progressive consciousness. And collective is important because too often within this society, we're basically driven to be individuals, which we'll get more into that in today's lesson. So that's one of the things I wanted to say. I got you, Karan. Let me go ahead and share the screen and we'll go from here. And during today's discussion, I do enjoy and encourage us to build with one another. It's not about simply me, y'all just listening to me talk, but what it's about is actually we are embracing and growing together and actually dialoguing to a point to where if something doesn't make sense or you disagree with a perspective, let's discuss it and let's talk about it. Now, in starting this off, we like to say what we're doing is having a collective build, because anytime energy is being exchanged, especially from the position that we like to refer to, we want to think of it as being a build session, because we want to be building each other up, not tearing each other down. That's another one of the elements that I like to stay away from as it applies to just simply pointing out the conditions of oppression. Because what happens is it strips a lot of times at our self-worth. It strips us from feeling and operating from a position of empowerment. Because, finding out that you're further enslaved than you was consciously aware of, again, but not reaching at it or looking at it from a position of problem solution, just really puts you in a position of a paradox, which oftentimes can be even worse than the original condition, which leads to more PTSD or post-traumatic slave operation and syndrome, and causes you to retract from society even more than what we deal with in our virtual world as it is. So let me kind of go into a few things here. Within the Panther Party, we always refer to our 3Ds. Let me say, not say always, but it is quite often a good measure for us to refer to 3Ds and the 3Ps. The 3Ds is define, develop, and defend, whereas the 3Ps is perceive, pursue, and preserve. And the reason we do that is because when it comes to critical thinking, what you find is, and especially as it applies to collective value, what is in the best interest of the situation that we're facing. So we like to say what is in the best interest of our people. And when we do that, basically it puts us back in the mode of recognizing that all of my actions should be registered with a sense of a personal accountability. And when we go into a sense of personal accountability for our situations, that means that we think about what this does to the collective body. Because within our reference point of working toward community empowerment and our reference point of working toward bringing our people to a level of togetherness, to where it's not just simply because Black folks are herded to live in one particular area, but actually engaging in uplifting and building the community, then what we find is that we have to be able to recognize and redefine or recodify our existence. So when you talk about what is in the best interest of the people, you must first perceive what that means. What is it to perceive the operation or community empowerment? What is it to perceive unity amongst my people? What is it to perceive empowering or advancing the individual, the family, and the community, and all of them being equally yoked or equally operated from? Now, once you have a perception that or narrative that you're reaching for, then you want to go into the defining how you get to that situation. And that is oftentimes where we find ourselves trapped through our conditions of enslavement or oppression as a people, period. And this is regardless of race, because this is a human condition we're talking about, especially as it applies to the masses, which is why we within the Panther Party say all power to the people. Because too often, especially when it applies to our public schooling and our grade schooling, that we are giving definitions. Those definitions basically generate a view upon how we see the world, which we refer to as our lenses. This is how you view the world. When all of your definitions are defined for you, that means your value system is defined for you. And if your value system is defined for you completely by others who may or may not have any of your best interests in mind. And mind you, this is why we're saying what is in the best interest of our people. Because often what defines your world and your reality is not what's in your best interest. It has to do with the intent of why I'm projecting or promoting or giving you this information or hurting you in this specific way or this specific manner. And most of the time it has to do with more so with a specific individual or a collective will that you want to project on a population than it does what's in the best interest of that population. And then the next step to that is to develop what's in the best interest of our people. And in order to do that, we must be willing to pursue and actively pursue the development. And this is where especially oppressed people or people that have an oppressed mentality, because mind you, when we say oppressed, let me clarify something. Oftentimes, because we view our world as individuals, we're taught to be individuals. When we say oppressed, people tend to ask themselves, well, I have a well-paying job. I'm not, I may not be starving. I may be able to get around. I have a good education. They start dealing with individual points of view. And when you look at things from an individual point of view, you may or may not see your life as being oppressed. You may not recognize what liberation means, that it applies to a group concept. So again, what is in the best interest of the people? So when we talk about actively pursuing development, we have to look at this from a perspective of the people, the collective. Because for instance, and this is just one of the things that is quite often stirred up on social media, which is police brutality, just using that as an example. There are plenty others. But when we talk about the condition that brings about police brutality, if you look at it through the lens of an individual, individuals tend to get justice as a result of being treated wrong if they're able to show a strong case. But collectively, the operations of police brutality will continue and will not change simply because you have individual justice. Someone sues the police department or sues the city and gets awarded millions of dollars because of wrongful charges or wrongful convictions or the death of a family member as it applies to police brutality. That does not change the conditions that brought about that police brutality incident. And so therefore they will continue to happen. Why? Because we're not addressing it as a collective operation. When we continue to pursue things from the standpoint of the individual, then we will get individual results. And you cannot fight an institution, an empire, by individual means. That again gives you an example on a narrative as why we say all power to the people. That leads again to the development. So when we talk about developing what we pursue, you have to actively be involved and engage in the process of making things better, which can't be done if you have not defined yourself and self-defined through the individual, the family, and the community, a way in which you perceive or view the condition in order to make it a better society better. So defining must come first, because otherwise, what you will have, especially pursuing it through the lens of an individual, what you will have is black capitalism, black imperialism, and black oppression, in which would not change the condition, just simply changes the person that is performing the act. And that's not what we're about. We're not about black folks or the oppressed basically becoming the oppressor. And that is what you get if you do not redefine the reality in which you're facing, the situation you're facing. And so we're not operating from a black oppressive perspective. And this is one of the misconceptions people have about the Black Panther Party, simply because we oftentimes are not able to control our narrative because we don't control social media. So we have to be real careful of how these things operate. So again, to develop takes a lot of energy, effort, and redefining and addressing yourself and fussing, I like to say, with yourself on an ongoing basis in terms of re-educating who you are and how you view society. The next level in addressing the 3Ds and the 3Ps have to do with what is in the best interest as it applies to my ability to readily preserve what I have defined and developed. So now that you created a foundation, which is your definition, now that you started erecting that structure, which we're gonna get into some of the aspects of the word erection, it's important. And then when we have those walls, and we now put a roof over that structure, that roof is that protection. That's what you get into, and how you preserve that. So how do you create the cell, the outer shell of the cell or the skin that is going to protect that membrane? And in order to do that, how do you readily preserve it? So again, this takes action. This takes foresight. And when we get into foresight, now we have to talk about you being a student of history in order to make sure that you don't repeat the same mistakes, or you have lessons learned from building your foundation and building your structure based upon sound historical markers and evidence of what was done in the past. So now we talk about blueprints, and now we talk about leaving a legacy within the Black Panther Party, San Diego, and the Panthers in general. The idea behind that is what we call a 10-point platform. That 10-point platform is included in this document. For those that have just recently jumped on, if you leave your email in the chat, I will email you the document that I'm sharing on the screen, so you can further go back into it and digest some of the things that we're talking about, and have it and be able to distribute it. Anytime we have one of these public builds, people, it's encouraged that we collectively talk and build on a session. When I ask, open the floor up, as well as the information that's being provided to you, share it to your friends, your family, your loved ones, those within your circle, because our goal here again is to raise the progressive conscious level of our people, and we all must take part in doing so. So if this stuff resonate with you and there's something useful within the lesson, please share it and please replicate it, because that's what we must do in order to deal with, again, collective building. So talking again about the preserving, you have to be able to defend what it is that you have built, what it is that you have defined, what you have developed. If you're not able to preserve it or defend it, what will happen is it will not be able to pass on to the next generation. And if not able to pass on to the next generation, then you will find that generation having to restart and redo the exact same thing and the exact same gains that you have made, which means that you're not getting anywhere, because you keep reinventing, as the cliche say, reinventing the wheel. Whereas oppression, and whereas the top percenters of world, the ones that control the world's resources, they're always planning ahead. which is what it takes in order to preserve and defend something. They think generations ahead, because in order to control the masses, to control a people, you must plan things out that way, which we'll start getting into now. So part of how we want to gauge the narrative that we're going to discuss is the nature of consumption in relationship to capitalization and the building of empires. And the reason why we approaching it that way, and I know that sounds a little wordy, which again, if the stuff I'm going over, if you don't grasp it right away, don't be intimidated. The idea here is take the information, send the email, I send it to you, and you just mow over it and work with whatever you can. So the idea here is consumption in relationship to capitalization and building empires goes into what has happened to us as a people. And what are we talking about? Black people, brown people, Latino, or anybody that is oppressed, or the collective masses in general. What has happened into why we are driven to purchase, why we are driven to consume, why we are driven to adding to the pile of capitalism, although we may recognize that this structure is detrimental and destructive to life and is not in tune with nature. But yet we're stuck in this cycle of constantly consuming. Well, we need to break that down so we can kind of see how it started to some degree. And then by doing so, that gives us an ability to define now the problem. So let me give you even a further example on that. If something is, just say somebody is shooting at you. Nobody wants to get shot because you recognize, we all know bullets kill, right? The first thing you want to do when you're getting shot at is duck and try to evaluate where the bullet is coming from so that you can escape and get out of the way of danger. Now, ducking is not good. Is not going to solve the problem alone. You need to be able to evade the situation. But if you are not able to ever detect where it is coming from, then you will be frozen in position. All you can do at that point is stay ducked, stay in position, and be tucked and just basically crystallized by your environment, crystallized by that drama or that trauma situation. And from their point, you can never live. From their point, you can never escape it. If you're not able to define or perceive the direction that the bullet is coming from, you may not even know if you're the one being shot at. Number two, again, if you can't determine where it's coming from, you can't determine what it is, but it sounds like a loud bang, then technically this is an invisible enemy that is able to attack and destroy you at will, and you're defenseless against it. Why? Because you can't define your enemy. If you can't define your enemy, you can't form a defense against that enemy. Remember that. And if I can't form a defense against it, then there's no way I can develop something in order to overcome it. Then there's no way I can defend it. So you see how those 3Ds all coincide and work with one another. And they work with one another in that order, because you have to define before you develop, and then you have to develop before you're able to defend. Now, it's super important that we recognize the order in which each one of these concepts come across. You have to perceive before you pursue. You have to pursue before you preserve. Because what happens is, if, again, your enemy has defined you and your way of life, but yet you go into developing before you have recognized what your enemy is, how you are oppressed, so on and so, etc., then what you do is you end up developing what you have emulated. In other words, the same condition that has haunted and oppressed you, you start developing that same energy pattern, and therefore you will end up defending oppression. Let's take this back to the plantation on what happened oftentimes to the slave when they have adopted so much to the lifestyle in terms of coping that When masters hurt, we's hurt. They change their whole language because they have been defined by that condition. So when master's sick, they say we sick. When something tries to free that person, they're afraid of that freedom. They're afraid of this. They fear something that they don't understand, that they're not used to. So therefore, they go back and they tell master that somebody is trying to shake up the plantation. Why? Because they have not defined their reality. They can't perceive past their own condition of victimization. So you have to put things in perspective, in order. Otherwise, all you do is end up emulating the same conditions that have oppressed you, or you end up attracting further conditions of oppression. This is like no different than an abused spouse justifying getting beaten by saying, well, this is how they show their love for me. You at that point are engulfing your oppression. You are taking in that oppression, and you allowing yourself to be defined by that oppression. So therefore, all you can do is develop a coping mechanism to deal with that oppression, but you will never escape it, which means you can never defend yourself against it. All right, so now that I've laid down that foundational groundwork, think about the 3Ds and the 3Ps within everything that you decide that comes before you in terms of just being a critical thinker. When you operate within any manner of your life, put things into those perspectives. Well, how do I define what is in my best interest? How do I define what's in my family best interest? How do I define what is in the best interest of the community? Think about things in that order. Develop and defend, perceive, pursue, preserve. Same thing. All right, let me move on. Number 5 on the 10-point platform of the Black Panther Party here in San Diego, we employ education for our people to expose the true nature of this devilish and decadent American society. We provide an education that teaches us our true legacy and our role in present-day society. Now, let me break that down a little more. Again, going into talking about and going into dealing with defining, developing, and defending, we must define it. So therefore, when we say we employ an education, we're basically saying that it is us as a people, it is us as the ones that want to change the condition of oppression that must employ our education, which means we don't rely upon society to define our education. Just say we're all dealing with a public school system. All right, we get that. That's academics. But what we must do is not rely upon that system to teach us how to free ourselves from whatever it is, that obstacle we're facing, which basically from this standpoint, we're talking about oppression. So as it applies to this level of oppression, we must employ the education that is necessary to free ourselves from this condition. In order to do that, that goes back to why we have to actively pursue what we develop. So keep that in mind. That is how that framework works in action. All right. And then to expose the true nature basically means now I am recognizing who, what, when, where, why, how my enemy is. And so by being able to recognize the things that are at the party, we refer to it as toys, which means tools of your surroundings. When we are able to identify our surroundings, our terrain, and our operation, we recognize the polarities that go along with that. And so therefore, by knowing that, we see that if the things of your environment or what's involved in nature is, if you're not utilizing these things, which means if you're not developing these things, they will be developed by someone else, which in that turn will be used against you. So understanding, understanding, and overstanding the true nature of the decadent American society, and we throw the triple K up in there so you can get a reference and framework in which we're coming from. By recognizing that society of oppression and what is that the gears that operate from that oppression, then we are able, like I say, to redefine ourselves, redefine our position in society, and develop a way to address it. But that goes back into power, all power to the people, meaning that we must do things from a collective effort and geared toward a collective environment and geared toward a collective operation and position of empowerment versus what we have been posed to do, which is to operate as individuals. Because when you operate as individuals, that strips you of the cultural recognition and the cultural values and the collective values that a society must have in order to be one with the environment or to be in balance with nature in general. So we must provide that education that teaches us our true legacy and our role. And this really applies to no matter not just so much Black people. I mean, it's specifically Black people, but anybody can utilize these concepts as it applies to addressing oppression. The bottom line is that if you want to make a change that impacts your society, impacts your community, impacts your family, impacts what it is that needs to be done within your legacy and your operation, you must employ that education. You must be accountable for that, which means you must also expose the situations and the conditions that are oppressing you. And obviously we're moving into dangerous territory here because you, at this point, and if those of y'all that study COINTELPRO recognize that now you're moving into a position where you're going against the grain. Anytime you go against the grain of something, even when it applies to natural law, you are going to meet resistance because you're going against the flow of society. And even when we're talking about flow of going against the grain, we're talking about the masses now, because if most of our people are drones or zombies as it applies to their awareness of the condition or awareness of how that they've been defined, oftentimes going back to that example I gave about the slave on the plantation, they may not recognize that what you're doing is in the best interest of the people, and so therefore emulating their oppressor, they will come out against you. Recognize, people, that this is a natural concept of dysfunctionality that is a human behavior that naturally goes against being oppressed. All right? Don't take it personal. Bottom line, don't take it personal that people may come against you. And even though you have what's in the best interest of the people at heart, don't take it personally that they will come against you, because we've been taught to hold each other down. We've been taught to fight against change. So keep that in mind, and you always have to keep that with you as you tend to operate in community activism and empowerment. We operate from an educational system that gives our people a knowledge of self. Having direct knowledge of self, our position in society and the world develops our proper relationship to everything else. That is very powerful statement here, people, because what we're getting at and what we're saying here is it takes that direct knowledge of self. You cannot have direct knowledge of self if someone else, or when I say someone else, mind you, I'm making reference to anything that works and operates to a position of channeling you toward being an individual, channeling you toward operating through a oppressive, means, is what I mean by that. So we must, as individuals, as family, and as community, have direct knowledge of self. And having direct knowledge of self meaning that you're on a actual, I would call, perpetual path of inner development and an inner journey of the learning yourself, learning who you are, learning your place in life. There's not, and oftentimes people have this, that are seeking liberation, have this thing that where they think that they're going to reach a tangible finish line, and all of a sudden there's this moment, and then they just start floating off into the bliss. That's not the reality, folks. That is not at all the reality. what you will have is moments and flares of being woken more and more to a process that is freeing you from being enslaved by the triggers that cause you to continue to operate as a slave. And these triggers, these conditions, these situations will you will be able to navigate them better and better as you learn to incorporate the 3Ds and the 3Ps within your day-to-day operation. But it's never a point of a utopian, escape, so to speak. So our position in society, world, develop proper relationship. As we do that, now we're on the path of addressing and living outside of dysfunctionality. Now we're in a functional position. And we hear that word dysfunction all the time, but you don't hear the concept of being functional enough. So our position here is to make each other functional beings, functional operations, not to be dysfunctional. Okay, so we want to break that cycle. We want to break that curse, and we want to be able to be functional. In order to be functional, you have to have direct knowledge of self. You have to know your position in society. You have to be able to recognize a worldview, which means you have to get out of the ghetto. You have to get out of the ghetto mentality. You have to recognize that there is more to life than just what goes on in your hood. Okay? And these things will align you to have a proper relationship with nature, proper relationship with the world, as we obviously fight against the things that oppress us. Okay, so everything is a process. It's not a concrete finish line that we're getting to. So I want to show you this first, and then we're going to show the entire thing. And let me just ask a question. It should be simple, but it may not, because pictures are deceiving. Somebody just tell me what that's a picture of.
Dallas.
Oh, come on. I should have known not to let you talk first.
My bad.
Anybody else? Ignore what he said until we get down in the lesson.
Could you repeat the question?
I'm sorry?
Could you repeat the question?
What is this a picture of?
It's a monument, but wait.
Okay, the Washington Monument is what it is a specific picture of, but to most of our eyes, we don't know what the monument represents. Going back to what our chief of staff got into, which is what we're going to talk about now. But also what I want to point out, and I'm just giving y'all inside information and clues in order so that our perception can wake up. That way we can redefine our realities, okay? This is what the point of the lesson is to redefine your reality. Notice how light is shining on the monument. Notice how the monument is also standing in a position over water. All of these things are intentional. As we talk about tonight, the subject tonight, I want everyone to be aware of the fact that all symbols have meaning. Most of the time, people are attracted to symbology, but don't know what the symbology is, and don't even know why they're attracted to it. Oftentimes, we just flash and represent things and don't even have the clue of what it is. Oftentimes, we do this simply out of the fact that you're constantly being bombarded with these imageries. Once the mind is constantly bombarded with something, we start liking it. We start becoming used to it, and we start conditioning ourselves to accept it. And as people do that collectively, which was also referred to as the monkey mind, what happens is it becomes a part of who we are. And we get lost in the symbol without knowing the origin and the meaning of that symbol. So what you see here is through the reflection, you see up and you see down. Now think about this in terms of being surrounded by a circle also. And then what you would have is a clock or a measurement of time. Now let me go on to the origins of some of this and give y'all a perspective to draw from. In ancient Kemet or Egypt, it states Osiris's body was cut up into 14 pieces. Isis was able to find or connect 13 parts, but the 14th part, the phallus, this is what we're getting at in terms of symbology, having been devoured by the fish or the waters, had to be remembered. Most people don't recognize that word remembering, and this is why we'll get further into that later. But the word remember goes back to the member being reattached. And now in the colonial America, the foundation started with 13 colonies. And the 14th, being the completion, formed the United States, became the District of Columbia, and had to be reconstructed. So the symbology of 13 and 14 goes right back to what is being represented through all symbology within the nation's capital. Within the district, Isis, or Lady Liberty, erected, remembered, for those of y'all that understand or understand and understand what Ra is, being the sun god, remembered Washington's monument, meaning it was a specific possession because it is defined as Washington's monument. All right. Oftentimes, again, we overlook what we say, and we're not recognizing that the symbology refers back to a position of someone that's being elevated above us, which is a level of control, which is a gigantic obelisk or palace. Hold on, I'm getting the echo back through. All right. Which was positioned over the waters to reflect the building of a new order. Do y'all see? Do y'all hear echo? Okay, it went away. Okay. Let me everybody mute so I can see where they're coming from. Testing. All right, it's gone now. Okay, just only unmute when you want to talk, when it's time to speak up. All right. So the position which was positioned over the waters to reflect the building of a new order, which has to do with how the capital of the United States is formed. This symbolism has fallen deaf over the years, and most people don't know the etymology, which basically means word origin, like Ra's member, known as his son or son, which oftentimes we don't think that that's where that came from, but it does, or that Osiris, who rose from the dead to bring you the horizon. The word horizon basically came from Horus, rising, by way of sunset. And sunset referred back to, again, which is why I'm showing you this symbology over the reflection of the waters, when the sun would set, which brought you down to position 6 on the clock. Or that Osiris, who rose from the dead to bring you, I'm sorry, I said that already, horizon, or Horus rising by way of sunset or set, who was the uncle that killed Osiris and ruled the dust, which is at 6 p.m. That's the position on the clock that the reflection sits, reaching the underworld by 12 a.m., I'm sorry, only to be overshadowed by day to bring the sunrise, or 6 a.m., which stood fully erect by high noon, which gives you the 12 p.m. And with that, we've often said, and you hear in the church all the time, Amen, which is a shortened version of saying Amen Ra. And now the reason I'm giving y'all this information, and it's actually a lot to take in, and I'm giving you a lot of symbology just based upon the picture of the Washington Monument. And it's important here because, again, remember we started talking about what defines your reality and how you perceive things. Go into your ability to be able to process, your ability to be able to create a condition or develop a position to overcome your oppression. So if we don't see things for what they really are, then we're not able to identify our enemy. And if we're not able to identify enemy, we can't form a defense against our enemy. So the whole point of this discussion, as we're talking about this and giving you a framework, is just to recognize how deep and how powerful symbology is and what symbology represents. So before I go on any further on this, did any name, I just want somebody, was anybody on here that did not know that this was a phallus, that did not know that the Washington Monument, as well as any obelisk, represents that?
I didn't know that. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it. I was going to ask you if you could break it down a little further in layman's terms.
In layman terms, and let me keep moving on as much as possible, is, in fact, if you just look it up on the internet, you'll see all types of things that go into it. It literally goes back to a lot of ancient, hold on, I'm getting the feedback again. It really goes back into a lot of religions, or religions that definitely predate Christianity. Because oftentimes when we talk about the symbolism, especially within the nation's capital, you're dealing with Freemasonry or Masonry. Now, when you start talking about Masonry, you start talking about secret societies, the language that they utilize is symbology. And when we talk about dealing with supreme wisdom or supreme signs or universal signs, language, number systems, and symbols are universal. No matter where you come from, no matter what language you speak, symbology and symbols can be referenced and can be utilized to get your point across everywhere. So when you talk about master builders, they basically hide things in plain sight from the standpoint that through certain symbols, I can direct the higher elite, or I can direct those people that are astute to a way of life without actually having to just verbally speak it out. Whereas the masses can be fed a by meaning or a byproduct, which is they're also attracted to, but they're attracted to it from a position of being subservient or being a servant to that which is the one that recognizes or knows the law. And so that's what's powerful and important about symbology, is because it creates a relationship for those that are in control and those that are oppressed, or those that are servants. Because the servants or the masses are taught to think one way, and those that are taught to run the world are taught another way, but yet the same symbols are used in both schools of thought. And so when we talk about the erection or the phallus as it applies to that, this just goes way back to the historical significance, or the significance of what an erected structure means. Again, we're dealing with symbology. So the symbology had to do with the fact that the man or the male gave off a positive, or was the provider, which is why the light shines around him. But even in going into that, and let me just go to the next slide real quick to just give you even more information on here. And I'm not going to necessarily read through that, but what you see here is it talks about the god and the goddess, and the goddess represents the circle, whereas the god represents the point or the center point, which is why we end our sentences with a period. Why? Because a period, and now we got to get into the symbology, because now this is some deeper stuff that I wasn't actually planning on getting into. But we end our sentences with a period because a period represents a moment in time, a singular moment in time. Therefore, when something is spoken, it must have a reference to a beginning and an end. That reference to the end creates that period. When you have that period, now all of a sudden, align that with a circle or a dot, And then the circle, meaning the all or the encompassment, which is 360, also refers to the feminine energy. So you have a dot in the center, and you have a circle around it, which also, from a symbolic standpoint, represents the I, or the all-knowing, which is the alpha and the omega, all in one. So see, these symbols can just keep going on, and they can keep stacking in terms of how deep you want to go with it. But be aware that everything that is done, to the untrained eye, it just looks like some nice artwork. And that's the thing. People are attracted to going and visiting the Washington, D.C. and the nation's capital, and looking at these fantastic monuments oftentimes because it just looks good in terms of the, again, the appealing of the artwork. But why is it that we are attracted to this? And see, that's when we start getting into the deeper realities and deeper truths to it. Because what tourists do is show up, take pictures, ooh and ah, and have this, and walk away with this good, this good feeling. But there's no significant meaning behind that. And they're not in touch with why it is that they wanted to see this, why it is that they wanted to take a picture, why they were led to or attracted to even visit it in the first place, and walk away from the experience with just good pictures, but no significance on the meaning and no significance on the process in which erected that structure, or the process that maintains that empire, which goes back to the nature of our discussion of consumption. And then talking about Lady Liberty. The Statue of Liberty is a statue of the Roman goddess Libertas, which is God or Lady Freedom, referred to Lady Freedom. And that is important because, again, when you look at the story of the origin story of what we're talking about when we talk about DC, again, he's dealing with the 13 colonies and the District of Columbia. And this is something that even escapes people most of the time. When we talk about the states within the United States, Washington, D.C. is not a state. It is a district. Why is it that everything else is a state, but then you have this one place that's referred to as a district? See, we got to think, what is it about that? And why is that district, when you go to inside of that district, basically you're dealing with politicians and you're dealing with people that manipulate and control our perception, but it's surrounded by a ghetto. The outer skirts of Washington, D.C. ain't got nothing to do with what goes on in terms of policy making. If you go through the neighborhoods and you see what's going on in Washington, D.C., it ain't, you would not, if you was not aware of it being the nation's capital and you just was in the neighborhoods, you get an entirely different concept and meaning of the city. Or should I say the district? But be aware of the stance and the representation of the Lady Liberty as it applies to the goddess concept and the male fertility concept and the erection there. Again, when we talk about erecting a structure, let's just look at it like this to break it down a little bit more, Ron Deuce. When we talk about building something or bringing something together, the male energy pattern is often referred to as the positive or the plus, which means it is the giver, whereas the female energy is typically referred to as the receiver, or the nature or the nurturer, which is in ancient Kemet referred to as nurture or natur. From that standpoint, the man erects it or builds it, and the woman nourishes it. And there is a balanced relationship in that equation between God and goddess. And these are the undergirds throughout all religion, have all religious practices operate and natural law operates. So when you get into these stories or these concepts as it applies to religion, or as it applies to symbology, or as it applies to the relationship between the slave and the slave master, it operates from a balanced perspective. So therefore, society gears its population to be at balance with the structure in which they want to operate from. This is why. Go ahead. Somebody has something. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah. Well, I want to interject because in dealing with the same kind of symbolism or slavery as we dealing with in modern times, in an overt manner, the erection or the ballot also brings you to the ATF, which is a trifecta of the government, alcohol, firearms, and tobacco. So, you see these, the people see these symbols every time you walk into a liquor store. It's a wall of erection. Every time you walk into a gun store, it's a wall of erection. And then, the liquor store may have, Swisher Sweeps or whatever. All of these things, that you can find commonly placed in the community.
Another thing is I read in Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGroy that the original depiction of the Statue of Liberty had her holding chains, and it was actually to signify the end of slavery, abolishment. But the people that funded the Statue of Liberty being put in New York didn't want that, so they replaced the chains with a book. But she still has chains at her feet. But when you go take a tour of the Statue of Liberty, they don't take you down to that part because they don't want to have to explain why there's chains at her feet, which was originally supposed to signify the abolishment of slavery.
Let me add to that, because again, even from the layers of truth, it also, because keep in mind when we're talking about the construction of this 1776, in terms of the independence, the breaking away of chains is also referred to as why they had originally 13 colonies. And again, going back to the erection of the Washington Monument, which basically means we are creating the new order here in a new land to break away from the tyranny that they were dealing with it in the European society, or should we say Britain, the British government, because they wanted to operate from a different form of relationship between church and state, which is why they didn't, the United States did not have a king or a queen. So the Statue of Liberty to them represented, because this was a Freemasonry, represented the breaking away or the release of slavery as it applies to the conditions that we are facing, not the end of slavery as it applies to property. See, so it's a different type of slavery, because they wanted to be able to exercise a form of religious freedom and end of certain type of taxation, which goes back into the Boston Tea Party, from being dealt with under a type of rule. So keep that in mind. This is also what separated, and now taking it even a step further, this is what created the difference between Mason and Freemason. See, now you have a Freemasonry operation. Okay, so it is a lot. It can go deeper and deeper and deeper. And so these symbolisms, these symbols reflect all of that. Let me keep going here. So together, I say, what does the above symbol have in common? Together, they represent relationships of freedom, justice, and equality. But when asked the so-called majority about the connection, it does not seem to resonate with most of us, because remember, it's projected and promoted as freedom, justice, and equality. Well, let me break that down a little bit. The reason for this for this is a nature in which we as Black people come about our own our journey within the American society did not position us at the center of justice. Therefore, we ended up with leftovers of freedom and having to continually fight for the righteousness of equality. Now, right there, I'm just going to ask, did anybody catch the symbology in which those words were laid out? Can anybody tell me the relationship to what was just said in that last sentence to freedom, justice, and equality? Because I'm gonna give y'all, this is just a deeper way of making sure people are able to pick up on just wordplay, uses, and symbology, because everything that's fed to us is typically done so for a reason. And based upon your level of awareness has to do with whether or not you're able to pick up on the different layers of truth.
Are you talking about the freedom, justice, equality?
Yes.
Well, only the free are allowed to have justice and equality. If you're not free, then it's not for you.
Let me elaborate on this from the last sentence. Justice is in the middle. Right here I said, we are not positioned at the center of justice. Therefore, we end up with leftovers. Left of justice is freedom. Leftovers of freedom. Leftovers of freedom. And we continually fight for the right. Right is equality, or righteousness of equality. Do y'all get it? I said leftovers, which to the left of justice is freedom, and righteousness, or the right, is equality. You see how that changes the dynamic? And it has to do with the scales, which also, without me being able to go into it right now, is Mayat, dealing with ancient Kemetic science again. Mayat represented balance. Balance had to do with how humanity is in relationship between the way it lives its life and the way it views its life. If you are not centered in your justice, the scales will tip, regardless of whether they tip toward freedom or equality. Because what you have to recognize about the balance between freedom and equality is that as you deal with one side over the other, you tend to lose equality based upon the amount of freedom you want to have. Because freedom means accountability. Let me just break that down a little bit. The more freedoms we want, the more responsibility we have. The more responsibility we have, the less equally distribution of the workload we can carry. The more equality you want, the less freedom you have to exercise your justice, simply because you want everybody to be treated a certain way, regardless of their contribution. You see, so a whole lot is actually being provided to you just in this one sentence. So as a people, we must position ourselves in the proper place within that trifecta. You have to start with justice. No different than when we talk about the 3Ds. You have to start with defining first, and then developing, and then defending. Because one thing leads to another, leads to another. If you do it out of order, you get a chaotic society, or you get a society in which will operate dysfunctionally. So by me merely teaching it to you, teaching you or defining to you as a people what you are, I control the outcome. So by me teaching you justice, freedom, and equality, when you hear the words together, they seem to be the same thing. So I can say equality, justice, or freedom. I can say freedom, equality, or justice. The point I'm getting at is simply because most people are taught the three words all encompass the same thing, it don't matter what order they're taught them in. I want to teach the masses out of order. Again, New World Order. We spoke on that earlier. Now I'm getting y'all to see how the connection comes about. When it comes to a new order or a new world order, those that I want to be the controllers or holders of power are taught in a different order than those that will be the sheep of that society. Although the same words will be applied and used to both societies simply by reversing or using technology in terms of how I distribute or how I disseminate that same information to you will control your perception and your ability to be able to free yourself. And I apologize if I'm going deep, but it's important. And these are the keys that we are missing as a society. Any question? All right, let me move on. Okay, our path here was that our path here in this, I'm going back again and not talking about slavery. Our path here was that of a commodity, an article or trade of commerce. The ability to produce work without the obligation of exchange gave the Confederation, which is I'm referring to as what the United States started as, the chance to build wealth, which served as an American foundation of this country's slave labor. This jumpstart put the U.S. in an advantage as it applied to gaining rapid growth as a world power. The rate in which this expanded territory and control meant the course of the United States was applying led to the form of capitalization in which became too big to derail. So what I'm getting at with that is because the United States started off its foundation with slave labor, it spiraled to a position to where you had to maintain a certain type of lifestyle or a certain type of growth pattern for that country. So it became too big to derail. As the technology of slavery met up with the innovation of industrialization. Let me say that again. The technology of slavery met up with the innovation of industrialization. The United States had to adapt with its foundation of free labor and reconditioning this labor incentive, leading to the world's largest prison industrial complex. So in other words, it could not let go of what made it the great country in which it became, which is that slave labor. What it had to do is redefine what slave labor was. And as it redefined slave labor, it had to come up with a process of still operating from its core principal values, but redefining it according to the population to where it will be acceptable and be digestible to the move that the country is making as it applies to its transitional process throughout the ages. And by doing it that way, the masses, even though they feel the heel or feel the pressure of being oppressed or feel the pressure of being done wrong, it is slow poison. That slow poison means that we learn to cope. We learn to deal with the conditioning of it. And this is not just the United States when I say this, but this is world powers. This is how the elite operate within a society as it applies to controlling the masses, okay? So I don't want to come off like I'm hating America, but what I'm doing is exposing y'all to the patterns that are utilized between those that control the wealth versus those that work for the wealthy. Because that same formula operates throughout any governmental structure. Now, going back to this, not being able to exist without the complete definition of man. This is where it gets important. That gave the formal commodity, which was slave, its human rights. Legislation was civilized Make sure y'all get this. Legislation was civilized to form rights for the property by way of the creation of the straw man. This way, civil rights could be erected. Going back to the term erection, civil rights could be erected and modified over time to hold power over the domesticated or domestic breed that can be taken away at will. The perpetual practice of slavery is a unsustainable illusion. Basically, what we're saying here is that the commodity, which was the slave, was not considered a human being. So they created, and keep in mind here, oftentimes when you deal with colonialization or colonialism, they refer to any people that they conquer as being, we're civilizing them. Remember that word, because the etymology and the way the word is being used tells you exactly what it is. But we have been so conditioned to hear the word and think of it not for what it really is, that we don't pick up on it. So the legislation created civil law or civilized the commodity, which was the slave. They didn't give you human rights or recognize you as a human being, which is why I say here they could not complete the definition of man, because to deal with man as a completion is regardless of race. It basically defines that you have a head, 2 hands, 2 feet, walk upright, have a form of speech, whatever separates humans from any other animal. That is a man. Okay? All having the same abilities, regardless of culture. Let's don't get stuck up on culture. Let's don't get stuck on race. A complete definition of a man cannot be operated or legislated or civilized to anyone. The mere fact that I'm giving you a civil right in order for you to be treated as like a man means that I have now reduced you to a position of perpetual enslavement, because you are not my equal. Why? Because this law says so. And the mere fact that this law was allowed to continue to exist and was allowed to continue to define your state of existence as it applies to operating within a specific country, going back to what? Your birthright, going back to what? Birth certificate, and without getting into deep aspects of what all of that stuff means as it applies to common law. The point being is you were created through civil law in terms of your operation. And by doing that, I automatically have a position of empowerment over you from the birth certificate or the birth recognition to the death recognition or death certificate. And I apologize if I went deep, but it's, this is where we are and this is what we must learn. And again, that practice, that perpetual practice of slavery requires the engine of the way capitalism is practiced here to continually to be used. And there's no escape from that, because you have not changed the foundation in which you operate from. Which brings us to another point number 1 on our 10-point platform. We are gaining freedom. We promote the power of practicing self-determination, determining the destiny of our communities, and defining the Black nation. Now, let me break this down a little bit. We say here that we're gaining our freedom, which basically means, like when I first talked to y'all and told y'all in regards to what the Black Panther Party represents and what the Black Panther Party stands for, we want to address collective progressive consciousness. One of the things that we want to do for our people, we want to promote progressive consciousness, collective consciousness for our people. As we do that, as a people, or as a group of society that wants to break away from the things that have continued to oppress us that we have not been able to define, because we're operating with that enemy being still invisible to us, we are in the process of gaining our freedom. We have to recognize that we are gaining our freedom, which means we have to put action to the idea of freedom. This is what separates the San Diego Black Panther Party's platform from the original Black Panther platform. And this is important, and I want y'all to grasp this, because again, the symbology of language, the words, the way it is used, makes all the difference in the world. The Panther Party of the 60s, the third generation, said, we want freedom. Whereas they were operating from a condition, and mind you, this is us operating in hindsight. In other words, learning from the condition of enslavement that we were operating in as a result of seeing now how our words were used to weaponize us as a collective. So we have to change our speech pattern, because our speech pattern has to do with applying what's also referred to as the word or the breath into existence and into life. So we must be gaining our freedom, not we want our freedom, because that is a position of inferiority. That is a position basically saying that you are not in the capacity to make that change because you just want it. But we are gaining our freedom. It changes the tense and it changes the obligation that you have in order to get to that end result, which is that freedom. And we promote the power of practice and self-determination. We are promoting power. By promoting power and actually practicing self-determination, we are kinetically engaged in self-determination. And so what we're doing, people, is we're doing the same thing as it applies to spell casting, just so to speak, that has been done to us to create us in positions of being an inferior being, or operating through our civil versus operating through our human rights. So what we're doing is recognizing that neurolinguistic programming was used against us to put us in a position of enslavement. So therefore, we're going to utilize that tactic of awareness and reverse it and empower ourselves through our speech, empower ourselves through the words that we use, empower ourselves through the fact that we are now defining for ourselves and what we are, and then developing that ourselves and holding ourselves accountable, and then being able to defend it and preserve it. So the way this is worded means everything as it applies to the use of it. Determining the destiny of our communities. We have to emphasize communities because the way we have, part of how we've been oppressed is to continually think as an individual. As we think as an individual, we don't think communities. And then defining the Black nation. And again, that can apply to any group of oppressed people, that you must define your nation. You must define how you put yourself in a position of gaining your freedom or gaining your rights. So this can be used by anybody. And there's a lesson to be learned by everybody as it applies to this. Re-embrace the spiritual high moral code of our ancestors, meaning we're going to tie back, or we're going to have that Sankofa to our beginnings and our lineage. We have to do that. We accept the accountability that Black people are free to collectively determine our divine destiny. Again, the way the word free is used is that we are accountable. We must hold ourselves accountable, which means we must be in control of how we define and operate and get to point A to point B. If in other words, get out of the victimization mentality of just pointing to white people or whatever as being what's holding you back. No, at this point, you holding you back. Why? Because you have allowed and continue to allow the systematic use of what oppresses you to maintain that same grip of oppression over you. So hold yourself accountable for the process. And as you do so, you are now free to collectively determine your destiny. And it must be a collective determination in order to reach that divine destiny. Okay, so the game here is to re-bridge a collective destiny. Again, we have to be specific in what we say. So let's discuss some definitions in order to reclaim our awareness, because that's what we're talking about, the symbology here. Okay, free labor. Free labor made its first significant appearance as a legal and cultural construct in the Anglo-American world of the 18th century. In one sense, free labor became free whenever employees lost the legal right to invoke criminal penalties for premature departure or non-performance. The defining characteristic of free laborers was the degree to which their violation of voluntary labor agreement were not punishable or imprisoned or physically coercion. Free labor, however, was also used in other sense. In certain contexts, the term applied to all labor performed by free men. Again, this also goes into why I wanted to show y'all the distinction within our platform as to why we say free to collectively determine, as well as what I told y'all earlier to make y'all aware of in regards to a Mason versus a Freemason. Okay, and that's just that we have to recognize that. And also, just to add another tad bit of information, the majority of the people that y'all know, Black, that have the last name Freedman, was simply because what happened was during the process of physical slavery, coming up out of physical slavery as it applies to the legal law structure, we were given the ability to change our name. So a lot of Africans dropped whatever their slave master's name was, and they made their last name Freeman. So I became, instead of being Robert Williams, I became Robert Freeman. Why? Because Robert, who I identify with, is now a free man. How many of y'all knew that? Anybody didn't know that? Just some tad bit information. So that's why that name started becoming used. And even going back further than that, it just identifies the fact that a person or their lineage as a last name signifies or breaking away from something in order to define their destiny in their course of action. So again, be specific in our intent on what we do. Okay, so performed by free men or anyone who was not legally permanently bound to labor for others, which goes us to slave labor. Invoked the ability of the right to own the product of the labor, aka worker. The owner was legally protected to conduct the use and operation of the product at will. This brought the ability to maximize profit due to the fact that the laborer had no right to rejection of the task, condition, and release from contract. That's what slave labor is. In other words, again, going back to the fact that we're talking about the commodity of the African here. From that point, you are not a man. Remember that, because now you don't have the ability to escape or break away from something that was defined as your existence. So that is the difference between free labor and slave labor. And it's important that we recognize that, because oftentimes you hear within the quote unquote conscious community, people refer to the United States being built and became strong because of free labor. No, it was not just free labor, or nor was it free labor, because free labor gave that individual the right to be able to break away from the contract. And see, it is the reversal or the tricknology or in our lack of definition that continually to allows us to be oppressed because we use the wrong words in order to, fight, quote unquote, free ourselves from oppression. We must put things in the proper context in what they are. So it was actually slave labor that built the United States, not free labor. Free labor is different because free labor goes back to the symbology of the Statue of Liberty as it applies to being able to break away from the colonies, break away from not the colonies, but break away from the king and queenship as it applies to who controls me. So as it applies to them, not us, it was free labor that gave them their right to develop the United States. But it was slave labor that we used and that was used against us that created the United States in terms of building up the actual land and giving it its power for those free laborers. See, you have to know what side of the fence you're talking from. It's super important. Hope I didn't lose y'all there. Y'all with me? Somebody just shake their head.
All right. Yeah, we make sure we say slave labor.
Gotcha. Okay. Now here we go, start talking about certain elements of capitalism by going into first materialism, the preoccupation with or emphasis on material objects, comforts, or considerations with a disinterest in or rejection of spiritual, intellectual, or cultural values, often fed into one's perception through subconscious means. So basically, when we talk about materialism, it is a condition that is projected upon the masses in order to continually promote and perpetually grind that engine that creates capitalism. And that's important because you have to embody the people with materialism so that we can continue to spin, so that we can continue to work, okay? So that we don't operate as free laborers, so that we continue to operate through a form of spiritual and mental slave labor. So physically, we hold ourselves in bondage to the condition of slave labor based upon the fact that we buy into and we embrace materialism as a way of life. To give y'all a good example, Christmas. What does Christmas mean to most people? Regardless of the fact that they want to try to say that it is the birth of Jesus, which is a lie, and I'm not going to get into that right now. The point is, most of us practice the purchasing, the buying of a whole lot of presents, and we place these under a tree. Going back to the Washington Monument, we are erecting this tree that is illuminating and surrounded in a circle with what? Presents. Now, how many of y'all connected the fact that it is the same thing? You see, that's why it's important that we know the symbology, because when we don't get it, we do it instinctively, not recognizing that what we are doing is practicing something that was fed to our subconsciousness in a way that causes us to mimic a behavior pattern designed to keep us in our place. It's that powerful, people. This is what you call social engineering. Okay, social engineering goes into how you manipulate a population, a people, whether it be individual, family, or community, or physical, mental, spiritual, to a position of your will and your bidding. So materialism was the vehicle that was done in order to make this happen. Now, spending, the product of expelling a resource, whether it be through time, energy, wealth, or resources in general, to use up, consume, or exhaust. The United States makes up around 5% of the world population, but consumes over 25% of the world's resources. Now, y'all tell me, it's obvious something is wrong with that picture. Only 5% of the population, but use 25% of the world's resources. Now that's obviously out of balance. And you have to recognize the significance of that. Because the United States is a world power, because the United States is the belly of that beast as it applies to that, its people have to be engaged in the highest level of consumption in order for capitalism to now spread its branches throughout the rest of the world. You see, this is the root from that perspective that we're talking about as it applies to the free labor balance and the slave labor balance. All right, because you have to be in balance. Remember, you have to be that justice, and you have to have something on the left and something on the right. It matters very much so what's on the left and what's on the right at all times, people. What is at your center matters. And what your perception is able to pick up on the left and the right is very important. And this even goes down to, without me getting into it at all, the Democrat and the Republic, period. Because oftentimes, what do we say? We're practicing democracy, but yet the country is a republic. So it is a balance between the two that we must teeter on. But that also depends upon your involvement within the legislative process, your involvement within politics, which is why the Panther Party refers to all education as political education, okay? Because a lot of times our people have been conditioned to not like that word. Oh, I don't want to learn politics. I don't want to learn. I don't want to be involved in politics. So we don't want our PE. But politics is everything. Everything is politics. That is the bottom line to that. You must be aware of that, people, because when you go into now redefining things in a position to give you your power back, you have to know and put yourself at the center of that education or that political process, which is more than just voting, okay? Way more than just voting. So I just wanted to digress just to make that point. Accountable spending, much different than spending. The conscious act of spending with purpose-driven intent. Specific words there for a specific reason. Purpose-driven intent that takes into consideration product, good, or service connection to you and the collective community in which you live. Okay? So when you are buying something, what you are buying is being weighed against what it will do for me, my family, and my community. This is called the circulation of the dollar. Okay, when we talk about the average African community, so to speak, the circulation of the dollar is at the most bottom of any other community there is, which is why that particular community is poor in its wealth in actual resource value. The more a community is able to collectively deal with accountable spending, the more wealthier that community will naturally be. Because now we're talking about the natural laws that apply to capitalism, the natural laws that apply to how resources are defined within a value system. So there's a big difference between what most people do, which is practice spending, versus practice accountable spending. That's super important, y'all. Pretty much everything I'm going over is very valuable. But make sure we get the difference between spending and accountable spending. Okay, let me go on to the next one here. Individualism. This relays and projections of the pursuit to individual gain based on a separation and advancement of one's person over the other, of one person over the other. Basically, what I'm saying when we talk about individualism, what it means is creating the condition to where you are enveloping or projecting yourself into what's referred to as a rat race. It's a dog eat dog, it's me against you, whatever, anything that you can do to divide and conquer, or conquer and divide the people. Constantly create a division. Okay, the word division has a deeper meaning than just the aspect of what people are taught in terms of basic mathematics. Okay, recognize that the words that are being used at any given time are for a reason. So individualism at its root is division. I want to continue to get you in the frame of mind or the frame of reference that takes you away from the collective process, that makes you continually subdivide and weaken your power structure, weaken your ability to be able to operate with any position of actual power, because now it's just the individual. Okay, an individual can't go up against an empire, period. So I teach the people individualism, and I hold them in powerless through the practice of materialism. By doing so, they spend and they don't even recognize accountable spending. So I've weaponized the idea of exchange upon that people. Intention: when a direct action is taken as a result of a planned event. Now, let me just go back to when we talked about dysfunctionality, because when you utilize dysfunctionality as it applies to your conscious actions, the word intention, when you think about a dysfunctional people, has no place within their consciousness, no place within what they do, because they spend without intention. They spend based upon their emotions, based upon their feelings, based upon what's being projected at them, based upon, especially like when you talk about social media and how we're bombarded with commercials, how we're bombarded with programming, whether it be through TV programming or radio programming. Commercials create an emotion. That emotion is attached to a reference point or an imagery of an action being performed. Subconsciously, you start appealing to the imagery that is used in order to perform that act. So you find something appealing that was portrayed to you. For instance, to give you an example that's obviously used on male society more than anything, is they'll put an attractive looking woman next to a vehicle. There is literally no real connection between the woman being used as an object and that car. But because we find that woman attractive, the idea that's set within our mind and our structure is that we purchased this car. Here is the woman. And that is a form of weaponization as it applies to creating a condition of holding the people accountable for spending and losing their power and their ability to accountable spend. And see, that's neurolinguistic programming right there, because you appeal to a person's emotions, and in doing so, you control their action. And people, this is done to us day in and day out, not only through the means of what we're talking about through advertisement, but it's just how we are taught within the school system. We are taught to be linear thinkers versus being non-linear. And teaching us to be linear thinkers basically forces you into a process of what's referred to as sequence of events. The way I portray a sequence of events to you defines your reality. By teaching you your ABCs and teaching you to think ABC, you think in processes and steps. If you by doing so, you'll crystallize to where you cannot project past a step. You must go to step B before you go to step C, and so on and so forth. You're taught the long way around something versus the most efficient process, which is why critical thinking becomes a contradiction in your reality. We can't naturally critically think if we're linear thinkers. And I hope that resonates with y'all, because it is important, and it is the only way that we'll be able to rise ourselves collectively above our oppression. So we must have intention. We must interject intention back into our worldview and our reality. But let's take this a step deeper. Super intention. Now this is the thing. This is the kicker. Super intention. When everything you have done is done with purpose, leading you through a defined lifestyle that is based specifically on the development or preserving your actions, way of life, and balance within a subsequent actions. So this goes back into the 3Ds and the 3Ps. Okay. When we have super intention, we have defined what we are. When we have super intention, our purpose in the walk that we walk, as it goes into developing something, was thought out, was planned. Not only planned now, but planned to the next generation. So I have planned my next generation cycle of being able to break any curse that I acquired through the unconsciousness of the cycle or the generation that was before me. I'm breaking those curses and those chains of oppression, going back to the Statue of Liberty or the Lady Liberty or the goddess from that standpoint. I am breaking those chains that have confined me in my conscious thought, in my way of thinking, away from being enslaved, away from being the zombie or monkey mind conscious or masses of people that continue to operate. So we must have super intention. Start using that word when you're around people. Just using that word to them when someone wants to talk about, yo, my intention is to do this. We'll say, well, why not have a super intention? And see how you start blowing their mind and open them up. Just start thinking of that. Again, the lessons that we provide the Black Panther Party are geared toward raising the progressive collective consciousness of the people. So what I need us to do is, those of y'all that are on this class, implement the things that are being taught to you, the jewels that are being provided to you through your group, through your circle. That way you are empowering others. That makes sense? Let me get a nod to that. All right. Now we getting ready to wrap up here soon. I apologize for holding y'all over. Okay, free labor to free money concepts, and I want us to kind of discuss this. And then we're gonna start off by just basically talking about free money. The reason why we want to do this first is to draw in the connection between the forming of the United States as it applies to the 13, which was the separation that came together to form the 14 or the erection, and how that is modernized as it applies to slave labor, to the way currency is being used. So free money, legal tender, not backed by commodity. Okay, because remember, the slave was a commodity at that point, right? Not backed by a commodity. Next thing here is currency, something that is used as a medium of exchange, or money, which is what we refer to that as, often backed by natural resource in order to be levied against value. In other words, what makes specific countries or nations' currency strong is that it is backed by something of value as it is exchanged, which typically money is backed by what? Gold. That sets what we refer to as a standard. When you set that standard, now your wealth as a nation or a body is increased. because that legal tender or that note that you exchange has a greater percentage of value up against someone else's note. Going back to you, Angel, this is why this is an example of why the American dollar is worth more than pesos from that standpoint. How many pesos make up a dollar? Give me an answer to that. How many pesos is a dollar? Angel?
Could you repeat the question? Is about dollar versus peso?
Yes. How many pesos make an American dollar?
Wait, please.
Okay. While he's looking that up, I didn't necessarily. You got it?
Yep.
1 peso. Oh, go ahead.
$1 is 20 pesos because wait. Can I trade that?
That's fine. I keep going. I'm just making a point.
Mhm.
Okay, just check it out. Deuce, was you gonna say something real quick?
Yeah, 1 Mexican peso is only about 5 cents.
Okay. So what we're getting at is the difference in the level of exchange. Whereas two nations are not equals. Why? Because one value system is worth more than another value system. That automatically gives me an advantage when I trade with you without even bringing to you what I want to trade. I have a cell phone in the United States. I have a cell phone in Mexico. We may have the same cell phone and we're going to do an exchange. Guess what? You have to pay me more to give me the same thing that you can get here simply because of the way my value system is backed versus the way yours is.
And I need to work more to get that phone.
No problem. Yep, that's exactly it. And that's unfair. But the reason why that's unfair goes back to what we're talking about, which is the nature of our conversation, which is how capitalism builds empires, and how capitalism is a beast in a self-destructive cycle in which, if we continue to allow, will continue to destroy the world in which we live, period. Again, if the United States is making up roughly around 5% of the population, but yet consuming 25% of the world's resources, if every other nation, let's just break this down like this, if every other nation were to emulate what the United States is doing, what does that mean about the world's resources? In fact, let's just break it down within basic mathematics. If the United States is using 25% of the world's resources, if you had four other countries, four other countries do the exact same thing to the exact same degree that the United States does, it will collapse the entire world's economy. Think about that. That's all it takes, is 4 other countries to the same magnitude emulating the same righteous process of pursuit of happiness that we enjoy here in the United States, the same level of consumerism that we enjoy here in the United States, the same level of just value of all of the traditions that we take for granted here in the United States. If 4 other countries were to emulate that, literally 3 other countries to even it up to 100%, you would collapse the world's economy. Now that ought to be saying a lot to everybody on this conversation, to just how out of balance we are in terms of a population, just how out of balance we are in terms of what it is that we are doing. And it's super important that we recognize that, right? So free labor to free money concepts. Now let's go against virtual currency, because this is where it's heading based upon population control. The digital exchange that is used as money with the value based on the conditions of perceptive growth in the want or use of that exchange. Now, this is a perception versus being backed by something. So therefore, the virtual currency, not backed by any real resource and therefore capable of reaching greater divisions. Remember earlier what we said about the word division and how it is naturally weaponized against a community or against a population. Period. It's a natural weaponization. It's an oxymoron from that standpoint. So, virtual currency is something that you want to start utilizing as a population grows, simply because you can't afford to use 25% of the world's resources and continue to increase the rate of which you are sucking up the world's resources, okay? And do that through a tangible, actual resource. So you have to shift to a virtual currency simply because you cannot keep up with the level of natural resources that you are projecting. It is impossible. It is an illusion. So a virtual currency is the answer to being able to continually practice that mentality just a tad bit longer. Does that make sense to y'all? Anybody got any question on that real quick?
Yeah, I wanted to speak on that real quick. I learned that banks actually, when you put your money in a bank, they actually don't hold all of the money in everyone's accounts at the actual bank. Right. So when you're looking at what you have on your screen, it's literally just a digital number. Because if, say, 20 people had, say, I don't know, 100,000 in their account, and they went to the bank all at one time, it was like, hey, we want to withdraw that. The bank wouldn't have it on hand.
Rick, the bank would close. The bank
kind of to elaborate. Sorry to interject.
No,
here,
go ahead.
Kind of elaborate what Deuce was just saying. Essentially, the bank pays you interest, right? So anything that we borrow per se, you get paid interest on. So the reason why when you put your money into a bank, they give you interest because they're telling you that we're using your money. They're letting you know, and they're paying you minimal interest on it, but they're letting you know that, yeah, we're using your money.
Let me give y'all the social engineering aspect to that. If I condition you to the process of saying that if you put your money in a bank and I'm giving you an incentive to leave it in the bank, which is that interest earned, you not going to want to touch your money, right? Which gives me the ability to turn right around and lend what John put in the bank to Jacob and charge Jacob 12%, which is going to pay for the 2% I give you for giving it to me. Think about that. It is insane, but that's exactly what is being done, and that is exactly what we fall for. I'm going to take the money that I don't own or that I really don't have anything tied with, and I'm going to take it from the left, and I'm going to add 10% to it and give it to the right and subtract and give 2 of that back to the left, and I collect all of the surplus in between. It's a win-win situation. Win-win. That is why bankers become billionaires and control the world's economy and the world's population and the world's resources. Bankers. And that's a whole deep conversation in itself, in a series of classes. When you want, if you were to get into the idea and the projection of economics and the whole engine in which it operates. But I wanted to give y'all a taste of the idea here of the transition of slave labor to a virtual currency. Because what we're talking about now is we're talking about how the way a government basically created itself out of a quote unquote exchange of pure profit, and will continue to basically grow that engine or evolve that same concept to move forward to adapt to the current condition of enslavement. Nothing has really changed. Nothing has really changed. It is the perception. Okay, and that's what we have to grasp. It is the perception. Obviously, as it applies to the commodity, you created a situation to where you're not physically as abused, okay? But the level of physical abuse, let's go back to these scales that I talked about, the scales of Maya, as it applies to this situation. They are still balanced, okay? They are still at balance. Whether we talk about slave labor or we talk about virtual currency, you are still dealing with that same balance in terms of the ones that control the world, making sure they keep everything operating on the level that inclines it to be able to progressively move forward and stay in power. That's what you have to be able to see. You have to be able to pierce back, going back to point number 5 on our platform, and when we talk about exposing the devilish decadent American society, it is the point of recognizing that world power balances itself out according to what it does on the left and what it does on the right at all times. And as long as us as people continue to operate as individuals, we're not able to recognize through our perception or our lenses that just because we're taught the same 3 words or the same trifecta of justice, equality, and freedom, depending on the order in which it is provided to us, going back to why I said linear thinking, because giving you linear thinking puts you in a position that the pattern matters not. Therefore, I will teach the masses a certain pattern, and they will emulate that pattern, and they will continue to teach it to their downline or their offspring or their reproduction, and thereby produce a new generation of slaves that will evolve itself into more slavery. Okay, anything that is being reproduced from the same cookie cut is evolving over time to operate within that time under the same conditions, because it is not breaking the cycle. So as long as the slave raises the next slave, raises the next slave, raises the next slave, that cycle of condition is perpetuated, and I can step back and reap the benefits of the initial work that I put in. It is powerful, people, when you recognize social engineering for what it is. And our job, one of our jobs, or should I say one of our aims within the Black Panther Party, is to help raise the consciousness of our people and to get the masses to have more super intention versus just knowing of the concept of intention. So with that, I'm gonna close out, but I want to go into one element of just current events and talk about sanctions currently imposed on Russia by issue, just so y'all can kind of get a taste of some of the stuff that's on the horizon that will lead to and affect the situation we're talking about. So here you got a chart here, and you talk about the different sanctions that are being imposed on Russia based upon, you know, whatever the situation is. And looking at the chart, the U.S. is basically dealing with 822 sanctions, as opposed to what goes on within Ukraine. The amount of sanctions that the United States is imposing on Russia is drastic just because of Ukraine, versus what the United Kingdom is dealing with, as opposed to UK, all dealing with as cyber warfare, terrorism, human rights, chemical weapons, you know, and so forth. So in other words, what I'm trying to show y'all real quick is you would think that countries typically get sanctioned the most because of human rights. Our thought pattern would be, you know what, you're doing things that are wrong to other humans. You're committing genocide. You're committing, oppressive crimes against people. And you would think the sanctions would be the highest based upon human rights or chemical weapons. No, look at how low on the scale that is versus governmental operations. That's where the power is. Why? Because you're dealing with power versus power. Okay? And when you talk about power versus dealing with things as it applies to again, that one side of the equation, that equality aspect, you only need to massage equality according to the consciousness of the oppressed. That's it. I only need to give you what you're conscious of getting. That's powerful. Let me say that again. I only need to give you what you are conscious of getting. If you don't know what you should have, I'm not going to give you what you don't know. Period. So as we continue to operate through an enslaved lens, we don't know what our worth is, which is why the Panthers always say all power to the people, because we need to have that power back. But as long as we don't know that we need to be the ones defining who we are, defining our destiny, developing our destiny, and then taking control of that and being able to defend it, then I am going to only give you this little taste, this little breadcrumb, because that's all you expect anyway. And that makes you happy. As long as I keep giving you that slow poisoning, you are happy. You don't mind that you're dying, just as long as I don't do it fast. And so in any of that, it's an abstract here, and it's just talking a little bit about what's up there on the chart. And after that, I just got our 10-point platform for those of y'all that are not familiar with it, just so you can see the overall objectives in terms of the patterns of which we are addressing the situations within the community and our work. And then there's a very powerful video that I linked here that you can click on if you again get this document that'll give you a little bit more information on materialism, as well as the link to the Panther 48 channel, which I am one of the trifecta members of, to where we constantly go over more information and we feed y'all as much as possible. With that being said, I'm gonna stop the share. Is there any closing remarks or questions before we end here? Anybody want to say anything or add to before we close out, or got any quick questions I can ask? I take that everybody's good. All right, well, I definitely appreciate y'all. Somebody unmute. Okay. I definitely appreciate y'all spending the time to build, again, us collectively building with one another. And I hope this empowers y'all to be able to build and bring this to other people and raise the consciousness, the progressive consciousness of our people. And with that, I like to say all power to the people.
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 We grew up in the hood like most black folks. Little did they know it comes gorillas from the South Coast, breaking them fools out, leaving them broken in many pieces. Black brain for now 5, extortion posse going to six with this revolutionary tactic. Them flips up under my mattress. I practice pro-blackness. Now they say I'm prejudice, what's spinning darkness. No, I'm not suicidal, but I'm dying for my people. No, I'm not authentic, yet I distinguish good from evil. I used to wear long crowns, align my mind to burn from ignorance. I cut away my perm, mine got strong. Some can't deal with this mentality. Think that I'm weak, I'm not no gangster. It won't be televised how many times my posse pull a trigger. Lord, oh Lord, am I the devil too, or am I really the son? Unto the throne, son, if all this true image of you, a portrait that I could not never see. Dumb as I may be, I never go, I kamikaze G, genocide.
rather creep through the middle of the night and try to rob. But have you ever sat and thought and had a clue that one of these days it'll all catch up to you? Genocide. You better duck when the chrome bust. 187 skills are real. Caps appeal that random extortion its anthem is to kill at will. But black on black is a tragedy. I creep through the clue. I'm colorblind, but I feel the bangers watching me. I guess they want a jack, put me in a sack, treat me like a crooked cop, throw up they set, and then I heard they clap, pop, pop. So now it's on with the drummer, dude. Somebody's mama is gonna be dressed up in a black suit, crying at a funeral. That show dead homies how it feels to be staring down the barrel of a trigger, lying in the casket. Some of us make it to live to tell how it feels to get blasted. I got smoke in the 9-1, had to pay my wages of sin, cause black men live by the gun, stuck in the trap.